Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's 29th episode of Making Sense, a Eurodollar University production. My name is Emil Kalinowski, and I am joined by the head of global research for Alhambra Investments, Jeff Snider. Good morning, Jeff.
Good morning, Emil.
Let's talk philosophers. We're going to approach different topics, communism, what the right monetary system might be, as well as dive deep into some of the mechanics behind the global monetary system. And it's going to be a high-level overview, kind of philosophical tour through our three parts today. And the first one, we're going to go to an article that got posted today, October 2nd, at Real Clear Markets. And the title they have assigned to it is, "There Have Long Been Too Many Have-Nots in the U.S." Jeff, you start out by talking about Dick Costollo and what he tweeted this week.
Well, he basically tweeted that me first capitalists are going to be lined up and shot when the revolution comes. And, I think the interesting thing is that, those kinds of tweets have been floating around quite frequently over the last few years. But what made this one kind of noteworthy was that Dick Costollo happened to be the former CEO of Twitter for 5 years between 2010 and 2015. So, when you look at both his tweet and who the guy is, and the fact that he has 1.5 million followers, you start to realize this revolution stuff they keep talking about is not fringe stuff.
And what kind of revolution are we talking about? Is it going to be a fuzzy revolution, kind of a unicorns and rainbows revolution, or are we talking 20th century nightmare kind of revolution?
Well, I think, that's the question. There's lots of different revolutions that are floating out in the Twitter sphere, but what unites all of them is that they have some thread of Marxism, socialism running through them. I don't think they've all decided on which thread they're all going to take, which causes, an enormous amount of uncertainty and chaos in its own right. But then again, that's good for the Marxist socialists who are trying to undertake a revolution. It's more like, what Lenin and Stalin did in the early 20th century. Hey, we don't know what this revolution is going to look like. So let's just do it and get it done, and we'll figure out the details after. And that's really kind of what we see in this quote unquote revolution that's taking place, at least virtually across much of the internet landscape. Is that, look, we don't really know what it'll be, but we hate the way the things are now. We'll just figure it out after it happens.
Exactly. Bingo. That last point is what I want to draw the audience's attention to. It's that revolutions they don't happen in any random decade. They take place when the existing order is particularly weak. And as regular viewers of the show know, that's what we've been saying. And we've also been saying that they have good reason to be agitating for revolution because things are not going so well. And in this article, you take us back to the originators of Marxism, which is Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and you quote, I'm going to quote you, and I was hoping you could explain this and what this means. So you say that Marx contributed in, quote, recognizing even for its opponents that capitalism, that which brought Enlightenment science into freedom and advancement for its proponents, was the key ingredient which did so. So it's that tension between capitalism is good, but not eventually, maybe not. So,
yeah, I guess the founding principle of Marxism is that, look, we started with feudal societies, simple agrarian societies where everybody was oppressed, and there was a few monarchies and nobility, kind of a flat structure where most people were oppressed. And the idea was, how do we get out of it? And what they found out through the Industrial Revolution was that capitalism offered a way out of feudalism, but capitalism, in the Marxist viewpoint, simply enslaved feudalists and the serfs in a different way. Instead of being a feudal farmer, a serf stuck on a farm somewhere, you were a wage slave stuck in a factory toiling away. And so it wasn't really progress in that sense. What was progress in the sense it was progress was that, look, society as a whole advanced from the middle of dark ages and into the Enlightenment Industrial Revolution, but that was sort of, to Marx, an evolutionary stage. We had to go through this crappy stage of capitalism and democracy in order to get to what he envisioned, which was the endpoint, this socialist utopia where everybody was the same. We don't really have to work because capitalism. Capitalism had created all these wonderful technologies for us to take advantage of. So that was kind of like, the natural, as you said, natural tension, the tug of war. We have to let capitalism do its work because that's where all the wealth and creation and technology comes from, this innovation and marvelous advancements. But it also has a very dark downside. What Marx said was because of capitalism's inherent contradictions, because it exploited workers, there would come an inevitable time when capitalism would end. The revolution was a foregone conclusion as far as Marx said. He said capitalism reaches its end. The revolutionaries then know to pick everything up and go on with the socialist revolution. And that's it's an important point. Communism and capitalism are not competing systems, even in the Marxist tradition. Socialism, Marxism, communism is supposed to replace capitalism.
I'm thinking back to when we first discussed this topic, maybe in episode 15, that we did it through the lens of Les Miserables, which was written by Victor Hugo. And I listened to the Great Books podcast, which had a well-known professor of literature review Les Miserables. And he made the point that Victor Hugo didn't look at the factory work as terrible, as enslavement, as a continuation of the feudal system, but actually as an escape, as a way for these people who were beaten down, as a way out. So if you want to say anything about that, go ahead. But if not, I'm going to go on.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I think a lot of us today believe that there's only one strand of Marxism, but there's an orthodox Marxism. And the truth is, there's been lots of different threads of Marxism running throughout the entire history, not the least of which is because it does seem like Marx got that wrong, right? I mean, he said, this was the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s when he was writing with Frederick Engels, and what he said was, capitalism's days are numbered. So here we are in 2020, if capitalism is still going, it may not be going well over the last decade, but I mean, obviously, we're talking about a century and a half waiting for capitalism to find its endpoint. And I think, even for the most committed Marxists, they have to say, well, maybe good Karl got that part wrong. Maybe he was right about history. Maybe he was right about his critiques of capitalism. But maybe capitalism doesn't actually have an endpoint. And so what do we do now? Because we believe in the socialist utopia. We believe in this idea. So how do we progress out of the idea, or out of the acknowledging the fact that maybe Karl got that one wrong?
I've got to work on my segue. So if I say something and then I don't quite know how to segue to you, so we're going to have to come up with a word, a phrase that you can tell me as to whether or not you want to say anything. And I thought of the best way you could do that would be to say, wow, you've left me speechless. And that leaves a lot of room for interpretation. Well, that's really good, or no, that was terrible. I don't want to say anything about it. And here's your opportunity to do that. Jeff, when I hear Marx and Engels, I'm hearing that they believe capitalism will eventually run out of fuel, and the fuel is the labor, right? So the oppression of the people, of the workers, eventually they'll run out of people to oppress. Perhaps this is a non sequitur, but have we ever on earth ever run out of any commodity?
It's not, I think run out might be too strong of a term, or maybe possibly. Oh, I'm sorry, you left me speechless, Emil. But okay. I'm gonna talk anyway. Okay. No, I think that the idea is in the Marxist formulation. It's all about profit. In the capitalist pursuit of profit, they necessarily have to exploit workers by holding down their wages. You don't run out of workers, but if you keep going after profit, and pushing wages down, eventually you push wages down so far that workers can't even make a living. They can't even survive on what low wages you're paying them. So you don't run out of workers. You've got them to the point where they're below subsistence level, and therefore, you've got all sorts of problems. That's when the capitalism system runs out, and that's where this new neo-Marxist strain starts to come in too, by the way. That's where we start to pick up, okay, well, if capitalism depresses wages to a point and reaches a crisis, how does it solve that issue? How has it solved that issue?
But you know what? Let me help Marx out. You don't have to run the workers into the ground below subsistence levels. You just have to oppress them, financially repress them, or not share enough of the expanding economy such that they're stuck at a certain level. So in the United States, famously, the real wages seem to have been stuck for several decades. In Germany, after the Hartz reforms at the beginning of the millennium, the workers started getting a smaller and smaller share of the expanding economy, even though they're super wealthy, right? The Germans and the Chinese as well. They have brought hundreds of millions of workers from a feudal-like peasantry into the middle class, but they did it on their back. They've been sharing less and less of the expanding economy with the workers, and their consumption levels are at surreal lows right now. So if, let me help Marx out. Now is a time where workers are being unfairly treated, and for a long time now.
Yeah, and so how do we answer that? What seems to be a big time divergence between what's supposed to happen and what happens, what Marx said was going to happen, what hasn't happened, and all these really up in the air types of factors. And again, it goes back to what we said at the beginning. The revolutionaries believe that the revolution itself will cure all these problems. They just don't know how. We just need the revolution, and then we'll figure it out.
And unfortunately, the revolution, it's been taking a while. It's stuck in traffic, at least around many places of the world. And in steps our next philosopher, Antonio Gramsci. Who is he? What was the dilemma he was concerned with, and what was his solution?
Well, Antonio Gramsci was concerned about exactly what you were talking about. What he said was that, look, capitalism cannot survive on its own. The bourgeois class, which is the capitalist class, because it's such a small minority, it cannot continue to perpetuate the system all by itself. Remember what Marx said. Marx said everything was coercion. It was economic coercion more than everything. Just the way that you put it, Emil. And what Gramsci and some of the later neo-Marxists started to believe was that, no, there's more to what the Marxists call these superstructures of society. And it's not purely an economic idea that, the capitalists oppress the workers directly, and that's how they hold on to their grip on power. What Gramsci started to think about was what was called cultural hegemony, which is the idea that capitalists aren't just, factory owners. They go to church, they vote, they participate in politics, they do all these sorts of civil activities where civil society as a whole has bought into the capitalist paradigm. And therefore, the way the bourgeois class continues to oppress the proletariat workers is through all of civil society. It's the media, it's the school system, it's the government. All of these things have all accepted the capitalist premises to the point that the capitalist premise becomes common sense. And so the workers who are being oppressed don't really realize they're being oppressed. They're slaves, but they don't know they're slaves. And the reason they're okay with it is because of what these Marxists call tertiary industries, which is the advance of capitalism through progress and technology that makes workers' lives appear better and better and better. So you don't know you're a slave, but your life gets better. And so capitalism is able to continue to hold itself up through the superstructure of cultural hegemony.
Well, Gramsci, he was writing in the 1930s. And at that time, what he was saying makes sense. But whoever is watching this right now was saying, wait a minute, it's precisely the opposite now. We've had our counterculture revolution, and the media and the school system and the academics and all the culture in Hollywood now is not supporting capitalism. They are supporting, more liberal views and leaning towards,
the revolution,
more socialist.
Right?
That's
why the revolution has become so common in virtual sense, is because you're right. A lot of these, that's what Gramsci was saying. Gramsci was a very influential philosopher on what had the countercultural hegemony, which was, a term that he coined. And what he said was that, look, the only way the Marxist is going to win, because of capitalism's inherent good points, technology, advance, progress, making people's lives better, increasing wealth, the only way that we can counter that is Marxism, to get the socialist revolution in a state where capitalism doesn't end, where Marx was wrong. How do we still go about with our socialist revolution? Where do we do it? Well, we have to have this countercultural revolution. We have to take over these means of civil society so that we challenge all of these status quos, all of these premises, what used to be common sense, so that when the time comes, when capitalism is at its weakest, we have a countercultural hegemony already in place that takes over. And they hope it's a seamless revolution, a nonviolent revolution, as most people do, but they don't really care as long as the revolution takes place. And that's really the point. What Gramsci was saying was that, look, capitalism doesn't just end. There's not a bright signal that we just say, hey, this is it, revolutionaries take over, capitalism's done. They have to do a lot of preparation work, which they've been doing for decades, in anticipation of that moment when it's most advantageous for the revolution to strike.
And is that how you end your article, by saying, quote, it's the proliferation of the knots which has made this time different, without anyone else to offer a scientific explanation for so many knots, emotion sure can substitute. An emotion, you're referring to Costollo's terrible comment about shooting business executives, putting them up against the wall.
Emil, even just Gramsci's argument, if you really boil it down to what he's saying, is that capitalism is really kind of good, but you feel all empty inside. So therefore, communism. I mean, that's really it's an emotional plea. It's no longer a scientific. I mean, Marx considered his view of capitalism's inherent contradictions leading to a final stage. He's considered that to be a scientific view, whereas Gramsci takes a more philosophical view, more of an emotional view that, yeah, capitalism does all these things. And by the way, it's going to keep on going, we think, because it hasn't stopped yet. So the only argument we have for the socialist revolution is that you don't know you're a slave, and therefore we're going to wake you up, make you realize you're a slave, and then you're going to give up, trade in all future economic progress for the socialist paradise. And it's not a scientific argument as much as an emotional argument for the communists and the Marxists and neo-Marxists, really, to say, I know what real meaning in life is, and we shouldn't have any more progress and advance because we're all just slaves to the capitalist system and the minority rule of the bourgeois class.
Joined by Jeff Snider, head of global research for Alhambra Investments. You can find his writings every week, like the article we just discussed, at Real Clear Markets. Now, Jeff, as we segue into part 2 of our show, I just wanted to remind everyone that this segment is sponsored completely, unofficially, 100% unofficially, with no permission whatsoever, by the Bitcoin Magazine podcast, which you were on August 26th. You were on there for 60 minutes. We were talking about the global economy as seen through the lens of digital assets. So I know we've got a lot of fans that are looking for alternative monetary forms. And if they didn't catch that episode, I recommend everyone check that out.